Hey everyone, like I said last week, I'm going to be reviewing Shadow of the Dark Queen by Raymond Feist. This is my first book review on YouTube, except for a failed attempt with my brothers. You can check that video right here. You get to see my truly immature side. So, as my first review on this channel, I'm going to be covering some territory that's a bit unfamiliar to me, namely modern fantasy literature. My few brush-ins with it in the past have been pretty disappointing. Forgive me, any Christopher Paolini fans, but I tried reading a bit of the Inheritance Cycle. That series has found millions of readers. Many people enjoy it. I just wasn't one of those people. Anyway, back to the book at hand, Shadow of the Dark Queen, which is the first book in the Serpent War Saga by Raymond Feist. Now this is just one saga of many that take place in Midkemia, the world that Raymond Feist has created for his series of stories. I mean, honestly, I couldn't count all of his books in this universe on both my hands. There are many sagas that take place spread out across the centuries, and some of them share characters between them. Some of them I'm not sure, I don't believe they do. Honestly, I've only read 2 books in this series so far. I will say that it did take me by surprise how much I enjoyed the story. Perhaps that has something to do with the low expectations I had entering this book, because the only other book I've read in the whole world of Midkemia is Tear of the Gods. And while it did have a fast-moving plot, it wasn't particularly novel, and the characters were really some of the most one-dimensional characters I've ever seen, except perhaps a novelization of, I don't know, Pirates of the Caribbean or something like that. It's for kids, and basically all you have to do is say, oh, Captain Jackson, and they'll all go buy it. But other than that, Tear of the Gods probably had the shallowest characters, or most poorly developed characters, I should say, that I've ever read. Shadow of the Dark Queen takes a different approach, even though it's by the same author and it's in the same universe. It has a lot more emotional depth, and then again, it's not like Dostoevsky, and probably throughout these video reviews I'm going to be referring back to Dostoevsky way too much, and you'll be sick of hearing him. And when I come to my review of Crime and Punishment and everyone hears me shouting from the rooftop, "Oh, it's the best book ever!" no one's going to want to read it because they'll feel like they know the guy's life story just by how much I mention his name. But anyway, back to the book at hand, Shadow of a Dark Queen. I'll say that I was, for the most part, pleasantly surprised. The plot was pretty unique for a fantasy story. I mean, you have your traditional conflicts between different factions and your little magical elements here and your strategizing over here. But it came together, even though I believe the ending was a little bit too easy. All of a sudden, this great conflict that's been building up for the entire length of the story is suddenly solved with somewhat of like a magic trick, which kind of was anticlimactic. You'll know what I'm talking about if you read the book. It happens like in the last chapter before the epilogue. And again, it wasn't a bad ending, but it seemed a little bit too easy, I think. I would love to describe the plot and really get in depth with the characters, but in doing so, I would end up spoiling a lot of the surprises, because this book is filled with a lot of surprises, which is something I enjoyed. On the character development front, it was better than what I was expecting, but again, it wasn't magnificent. I mean, Charles Dickens and Nathaniel Hawthorne and, again, Dostoevsky are much better at this sort of thing than the books from Raymond Feist that I've seen so far. But it was decent. At least the primary characters felt like real people. The side characters, not so much. I mean, you got the feeling that because the main characters cared for the side characters, you're supposed to care about them too as the reader. And it didn't exactly translate that well. And sometimes the dialogue would end up being almost interchangeable between the side characters. That's a problem I have with not just books that I've seen so far in modern fantasy, but books in general, that they just don't seem to have a lot of concentration in making these characters distinct. Like, maybe you could get away with it in a screenplay where, you know, you have your casting and you cast different characters with different actors, and you might be able to pull it off. But in a book, all you have is the text. And if the characters all sound the same, it can be a little off-putting. And in the times they do in this book try to have some distinction, the little, accents or whatnot sometimes come off a little stilted. Again, I'm using that word a lot for the dialogue, but it did end up being that way. Even amongst the main characters, I don't like it when I see the dialogue just serving the plot. Hey, shouldn't they kind of complement each other? They should. But the dialogue should be natural, real life. As you're going along, whether you're at work or you're at school, you're trying to do your best to get through life. But you're not planning every word you say. If I'm reading a story that may not have a realistic setting but is trying to gain the reader's empathy, I want to have relatable characters. That, I think, is one of the biggest problems. The dialogue doesn't really stand on its own. Most of the sentences are very short. The more philosophical musings of the characters are generally taken care of in rather unpoetic thoughts to themselves, or when they do express their feelings, it's kind of, I don't know about cliche in delivery, but very basic. Now, that's not to say that everything is just simply action or blunt commands. There are some poignant moments. One of the characters, who was sort of plucked from an agrarian society and thrust into war, has a lot of contemplation about what kind of person he's becoming. I do appreciate the revulsion he feels at seeing so much violence and how it affects him mentally and physically. And I would love to see that explored more deeply, but it's not. A lot of times, the best moments in the book are relegated to play second fiddle to the more action-oriented elements of the plot. And of course, that's not to say there's anything intrinsically wrong with that. It just caters to a different audience than I would claim membership to. My favorite moment out of the entire story was when one character has become part of a mock mercenary sort of group. It's kind of like a special forces kind of deal to infiltrate the enemy. And he's noticing that he feels, affection for his comrades. He's gaining a sense of camaraderie amongst his fellow soldiers. And yet he notices that this sort of ragtag team is composed mostly of former murderers and criminals and all this kind of stuff that he never was a part of before. And he starts to question whether or not this is actually a good thing, that he feels such a connection with them. He wonders what sort of person he's turning into. Is he becoming more like them, despite his attempts to retain his honor in the face of so much dishonor? And I think that was a great look at how such situations can be, whether in small ways or larger ways. I believe many of us have encountered situations like that, whether it's falling into the wrong sort of crowd of friends, or maybe not even falling into the wrong crowd, but a different crowd, and you may have wonderings. I mean, are you changing as a person? And if you are, is it for the better or is it for the worse? I like that. But the problem is, it was only like one paragraph. One paragraph. And there's so much that could be explored. If I was advising Raymond Feist, no one would want me advising them on their book. If I was, his book would probably be 3 times longer, 4 times longer, and it'd be all this rambling, questions about morality and conundrums of ethics and all this kind of stuff, and no one would want to read the book. So it does serve its purpose well. It wants to be an exciting story, and it is an exciting story. At the same time, it does lend some emotional depth to at least 3 of the characters. But I do feel it could have been handled a little better. And not everyone can be Charles Dickens, who can maintain an exciting story and keep you turning the pages and have a great humanity to the characters. But I believe that was just a little bit more effort in the character development section. This book could be much more than the middling fantasy that I would name it. Oh, middling fantasy. I guess that's sort of harsh, because it's not the worst book in the world. I guess that's why it would be middling. I mean, it is written for male teenagers. That's what I would guess anyway, from the style of the story and the way the book is plotted. Yet, even though it is a book pretty obviously, I think, targeted towards young men, and the viewpoint in the novel is definitely a male's point of view, I think that one of the worst offenses of this book is really the complete disregard was developing its female characters. Almost every female character that shows up in the book, and most of them don't show up for more than a page or two, is shown in a position of peril. There's a lot of rape threats in the book. There is even a scene of rape, which not that those things don't happen in real life, but to see women only portrayed as victims, I don't believe is healthy for any audience. I know I felt uncomfortable, not just the fact that it was discussing those things, because again, they do happen, and those issues need to be addressed, but I didn't feel, again, I'm coming back to sort of emotional shallowness. And it sort of seemed to get worse as the book went along. If you notice my previous vlog, I had some hopes for this book, but the female characters in this book were just, I think, really poorly written. Or just the message it sends of just showing women as victims, I just think is supremely unhealthy. And the one strong female character was pretty shabbily written, I felt. Miranda was her name. She was some sort of magician who seemed to be a bit immortal. Her background's kind of cloudy. It never really delves into that. I guess maybe they're setting her up to be explored more in sequels, perhaps. Again, these books are old, but I mean, I'm just reading them for the first time. But she felt like a token, strong female character, just shoehorned into the story without any real thought in treating her as an individual entity. She just seemed a useful plot convenience to show off her powers and save the characters along the way. Which, I mean, it's great, you know, she comes to the rescue. I mean, it's a counter to the damsel in distress stereotype, which is, you know, I'm all for that. But it just felt so hollow. Like, it was just, hey, well, we want to have something a little bit atypical of fantasy, so we'll have the strong female character who does awesome things with magic. Okay, great so far. What about the personality? Don't worry about that. They'll just be looking, hey, look, she did this little incantation and fried the lizard people. I mean, that's pretty much it. And then there's always this slight, like, innuendo in a lot of the dialogue. I mean, it's not the worst I've seen, but maybe it's just a lead up in the narrative where it's like, oh, she wouldn't be described as pretty, but she was so striking. And then, you know, seconds later, it's like, and no, she was quite beautiful. That's all the narrative seems to take interest in. And maybe I'm just being really harsh, but I've seen female characters be written well. Charles Dickens, there was personality behind these characters. And then, of course, one of my favorite authors, Dostoevsky, in Crime and Punishment and in The Brothers Karamazov, the women in his stories occupy multiple positions in society, play many different roles in the narrative, but they're all real people. I've already criticized the characters as a whole as being a bit shallow, but the female characters in particular, they were depicted as victims for the most part, or objects. There's this one scene where the camp that's taking its rest for the night, and they're near a town, and of course, you know, it's like, oh, hey, it's a semi-medieval kind of fantasy setting. Let's have the entertainment come by the camp. There's a couple of prostitutes who come to the soldiers. I don't know, I was really hoping that the main character, who had been honorable up to this point, would refrain from engaging in such a demeaning practice. And you get the feeling it's going to happen because he hesitates when the offer's made, and then he goes and engages, and he's all happy about it. There's a brief moment where he wonders, maybe I'm buying into a awful system. But again, any of these poignant moments are just taken care of with a sentence, as if, well, we have to get the moral uncertainty out of the way, and let's get back to the action. And he wanders off all happy with himself. And just, I don't know, it bothers me. You can't just hand wave these issues. They're very real issues in the real world, and to just kind of deal with them as building blocks for your protagonist, I think is a little insensitive. Again, most of the women in the story feel like they're portrayed as victims or objects, if they even show up at all, which is rare, except for Miranda, but she's, again, really, I think, poorly written. Even at the end, they have to take her more dedicated side, just focused on the mission, focused on protecting the people, and there's like this whole mass of carnage that she just witnesses, and she's flirting with one of her comrades, and then he's reciprocating that. I don't think real people, after a massive battle has been fought and there's thousands of lives, tens of thousands of lives that have been lost in brutality, just a bloodbath. And now let's talk about, oh, I've had so much work, let's take a vacation on the beach, and they're like planning to teleport over with their little spells or whatnot. Just annoying, a really annoying note to end the book that had so much promise. So in the end, I can't really give it any more than 2 out of 5 stars, and that's my rating. Thanks for listening to me rant on about a book that I had high hopes for, but ended up not really liking. Please share your thoughts below in the comments. I mean, maybe you could convince me that it wasn't as bad as I thought. I mean, I don't want to offend any fans of the work. I'm sure there's more merit in the story than I noticed, and I'd love to hear your side of the story. And that's a wrap. See you guys next week.